All right, welcome back. In this video, we're going to be looking at chemical bonds and the properties of water. In this section of Chapter 2, we're going to go over chemical bonds. I have the bonds listed here from strongest at the top to the weakest at the bottom, where nonpolar covalent bonds are the strongest and van der Waals interactions are the weakest. This might be different from what you learned in chemistry, where your professors may have told you that ionic bonds are the strongest. In biology, we consider covalent bonds the strongest. This is because in chemistry, it's generally assumed that all the molecules you're looking at, the reactions you're looking at, those are happening within a vacuum. In biology, however, because we're looking at living organisms, we make the assumption that these molecules, these reactions, they're happening in water, in which case covalent bonds and nonpolar covalent bonds in particular will be the strongest. So covalent bonds are formed when electrons are shared between atoms. In chemistry, you may have seen the formation of single bonds, double bonds, where more than one set of electrons are shared like this, and even triple bonds. So atoms share electrons in covalent bonds. However, this sharing can be equal or unequal. Nonpolar covalent bonds are stronger than polar covalent bonds. And this is because in nonpolar covalent bonds, the atoms have equal or similar electronegativities. Electronegativities are an atom's affinity for electrons. I like to think about this as like how greedy an atom is for electrons. And in this first one, this first nonpolar covalent bond example, we're looking at carbon and hydrogen. These have very similar electronegativities. Carbon actually has an electronegativity of about 2.5, hydrogen 2.1. So they're both poling electrons. They both like electrons fairly equally, and there's no charge difference when we're looking at this bond. Looking at this lower example, it's kind of interesting because although oxygen's electronegativity is 3.0 and it's greater than carbon's electronegativity, which is 2.5, making the single interaction between carbon and oxygen polar, where oxygen, because it's more electronegative, is partially negative, and carbon, because it's not as electronegative, it's partially positive. The molecule CO2, or carbon dioxide, is actually nonpolar overall because of the linear structure of the molecule. There's an equal pull of electrons to the left and right, or however it's facing the orientation of the molecule, by the two oxygens on either side of the carbon atom. So both the bond type and the molecular shape are important to determine if a molecule is polar or nonpolar. In polar covalent bonds, what's going to happen is one atom, like the one shown here, oxygen, is significantly more electronegative than the other atom. Here we see this at the top left. Oxygen has an electronegativity of 3.5. Hydrogen is 2.1. So oxygen is more greedy for electrons, and it becomes partially negatively charged because it's hogging that that negative cloud of the electrons. Whereas hydrogen is partially positively charged. And these symbols, these are the lowercase Greek delta symbols that are scattered throughout the images here. These mean or represent partial charge. So this, I can't really do it that well. Partially negative, partially positive. So those are partial charges compared to like full positive or negative charges. In ionic bonds, the electronegativity difference between the two atoms is so significantly different that the more electronegative atom actually steals an electron completely away from the less electronegative atom. So here, chlorine is much more electronegative than sodium, so it steals an electron away, leaving sodium positively charged, and now chlorine, it's chloride, is negatively charged. And that attraction between the opposite charges is what forms the ionic bond. So that's different from what we saw earlier, the polar covalent bond, because oxygen, even though it's more electronegative, is not actually stealing the electron away. It's just that the electrons spend more time spinning around the oxygen's nucleus than it does spinning around the hydrogen atom's nucleus. And here's another one of my wonderful memes that I found on the internet. So this one lost an electron, so it's positive. Okay, so we had nonpolar covalent bonds, polar covalent bonds, ionic bonds. Our fourth type are hydrogen bonds, a much weaker type of bond that forms between molecules containing polar covalent bonds. And our last type are van der Waals interactions. Note that while our stronger bonds require high energy to break, these do not, and they break and reform pretty readily. Here's an image showing several hydrogen bonds. So we saw that the bond between oxygen and hydrogen is polar covalent, where oxygen is partially negatively charged and hydrogen is partially positively charged. If you happen to have, here's one water molecule, another water molecule close by, hydrogen bonds form between them due to the partial charge that you see on one water molecule being in close proximity to a partial charge of the opposite charge on the other water molecule. So hydrogen bonds form between water molecules. And if you've ever played with magnets, to kind of sense how hydrogen bonds would feel like, if you could feel them, it feels like when you hold two magnets that are attracted to each other closely together but don't let them touch. You can feel that pull between the two magnets, which would represent the two water molecules. And one hydrogen bond is very weak, but many molecules contain hundreds of hydrogen bonds, which are collectively strong. So note that there are no hydrogen bonds in a single water molecule. That's only polar covalent bonds and two of them. But there are hydrogen bonds between water molecules. And the weakest interactions are van der Waals interactions, which generally form due to temporary dipoles that are created when two or more molecules come close to one another. So a simplified version, let's say I have an atom or a molecule over here, and it has electrons surrounding it. So that's the electron cloud. I have another atom over here with its electron cloud. I'm going to change it to a different color. If they come close to each other, what happens is this induces a temporary dipole. The electrons don't like each other because they're both the same charge. They're both negatively charged. So if they come closer together, this is going to induce or cause the electrons to spend more time on the left side of this molecule or atom. That will leave the right side of this molecule or atom slightly positive, and that induces the shape of the electron cloud in this molecule or atom to also change. So the electrons will spend more time on the left side of that atom or molecule. So this is what it looks like. They can get stronger when you have big lipids that we'll see later on, and you have a lot of atoms forming these van der Waals interactions. So water is our next topic, and it's the most critical molecule for life on Earth. And this is because it's required for most biochemical reactions to occur. It makes up most of the cells in our bodies. And in terms of chemical reactions, sometimes when people are tired, instead of reaching for coffee, sometimes all you might need is just water. We'll see that water is a reactant in many, many biochemical reactions. What makes it so special? So it makes up a huge amount of our body as well as most cells. The reason water is unique is because it's polar, like we saw in the previous slides, and it can form hydrogen bonds. These two properties gives it its essential characteristics and important role to life. So this slide is a review of what I went over earlier. We remember that hydrogen has a partially positive charge, oxygen is partially negatively charged, and hydrogen bonds are formed between adjacent water molecules. Molecules that can mix with or dissolve in water are known as hydrophilic molecules. Hydro means water and philic means loving. So these molecules are usually comprised of polar covalent bonds, hydrogen bonds, ionic bonds. In contrast, hydrophobic or water-fearing molecules do not mix with water. They're usually made up of molecules with many, many non-polar covalent bonds. Van der Waals interactions are actually found in both types. If you ever try to mix oil, which is hydrophobic, and water, which is hydrophilic, you'll see that they don't mix. And after a few seconds, it might look like this at first, but a few seconds later, all the oil will kind of gather together to get as far away from the water as possible. In chemistry, they often say like dissolves like. So hydrophilic molecules mix well with other hydrophilic molecules. We often say polar instead of hydrophilic for short. Imagine you're making toast and you're getting the butter out, you're spreading it over your bread, and you get some on your hands. How do you get butter off of your hands? Can I just rinse with water? No, that doesn't usually work. I still feel greasy. My fingers will still feel greasy. So that doesn't work. But soap works pretty well. And the reason it works well, we'll see later on, but it's because that soap has both hydrophilic and hydrophobic properties or components. The hydrophobic portion will bind to the butter and form these like cool spherical structures where the oil, the butter is in the middle, and the hydrophilic portion will be facing the outside and allows water to pull and rinse the butter off of your hands. Oh my gosh, another one. Okay. Why did the white bear dissolve in water? Because it was polar. So cute. Hydrogen bonds are also why water has unique characteristics in its various states. Usually, you think of the solid state of a molecule as denser than the liquid state. But for water, it's like the opposite, right? Ice or solid water is less dense than liquid water. And that's very important. One of the reasons is because it allows ice to float above water. And this happens because the average distance of hydrogen bonds between water molecules in the solid form, the water molecules are actually further apart in the solid form in ice than in the liquid state. In lakes and ponds, ice will form on the water's surface, creating a nice insulation or insulating barrier that protects all the animals and plants inside the pond or inside the lake from freezing. Without ice being less dense than water, then the whole thing would freeze. And all of the animals and plants and other microbes in the pond or lake would freeze and not survive in the wintertime. Something else that can be both detrimental or beneficial is when ice is formed, it expands relative to liquid water. That can be detrimental because it could freeze. When it freezes, it could kill living organisms when the cells burst. It can also be beneficial to us, and we actually use this in some cases, such as flash freezing certain foods that we want to eat raw, like raw fish. Sushi grade fish is flash frozen because we know it's not going to be cooked to kill any microbes. So in order to kill anything that could be harmful, it's frozen and those cells are ruptured and it kills any microbes or anything that could be harmful and cause food poisoning. Another important property of water, it has a very high heat capacity. So it takes a lot of energy to heat 1 gram of water up and raise it by 1 degree Celsius. It takes a lot of energy and it takes a lot of time to heat water up, but also to cool it down. which means water can absorb a lot of energy before it changes temperature. And this is important in maintaining Earth's temperature and also, for example, on a smaller scale, our own bodies, allowing us to sweat and cool down. Similarly, water also has a really high heat of vaporization going from liquid to gas. So very similar to heat capacity. So water changes temperature as it changes temperature. It does so very slowly. And again, these properties are due to the polar covalent bonds found within each water molecule, and that giving the ability of water to form hydrogen bonds with one another. So it's hard to break these bonds and form gas, for example, from liquid water. It takes a lot of work. Water is also great because most things can dissolve in water, right? Most polar molecules, ionic molecules, they can dissolve in water. And this would make water the solvent and whatever you're trying to dissolve into the water, the solute. Our book gives us a nice example. We all have salt probably at home. If you put a little bit of salt into a cup and add some water and stir, you'll see that we form these little hydration spheres where water surrounds the ions that are formed. And if you look closely at the hydration spheres, you can see since water is polar, the bonds within water are polar. I know oxygen is partially negative, hydrogen is partially positive. I can see that the partially positive hydrogens are facing the negatively charged chloride ion, whereas in the right side, it's opposite. The negatively or partially negative oxygen atoms are facing the positively charged sodium ion. Cohesion is another property. What is cohesion? So that means that water likes to stick to water. They bind together through those hydrogen bonds. And one example is, for example, whenever I'm trying to boil water, it takes forever because the water molecules that are forming the hydrogen bonds in the liquid state don't want to let go. It takes a lot of work for me to get them to release one of the water molecules and release it into a gas state. And that cohesion, those water molecules that are bonded through those hydrogen bonds, allows the formation of surface tension. So certain things can be placed on top of a surface of water without falling down, without falling through. Another property is adhesion. So cohesion was when we looked at water sticking to other water molecules. Adhesion is when water sticks to something else, like glass. We will often see when we put water into some kind of glass container, like a capillary tube or maybe a graduated cylinder that's made of glass, we'll see a meniscus form due to capillary action. And this is because water is actually more attracted to the glass walls of the container than to each other. It's like adhesion wins over cohesion. And you see water moves up the sides of the glass container because of its attraction to the container, to that glass. And this takes us to the end of part 2 of chapter 2. There's one more part to the set of videos. And in that third part, we're going to be looking at pH and buffers, carbon a little bit more closely, as well as a few functional groups. All right, thank you.